And so now officially, good morning and welcome to our pop-up on neurodivergent leadership. And I'm going to hand over very straightforwardly to John. And Rick, if you could spotlight John and Helen, please.
So good morning, and for those of you who, most of you whom I think won't know me, though I do recognise a number of faces in the audience. My name's John Higgins. I'm the Research Fellow at GameShift, and today I'm going to be in conversation with Helen Evans, who will introduce herself as the presentational part of today unfolds. So a little bit about how we met. We both appeared on a recent edition of Evan Davis's The Bottom Line, that Radio 4 programme. The topic in question was organisational denial and what leads to organisations burying their heads in the sand. Now, we had very different takes on this, not in a conflictual way, but Helen reporting from her inside experience of organisational life, while I came at it from a more academic researcher perspective. During that interview, Helen also foregrounded her experience as an autistic chief executive officer in the charity sector. And I think it is polite to say that mutual curiosity ensued. And actually, curiosity, I think, is one of the key themes that will run through the conversation. And it is what has really kept us together as we've prepared for today. So curiosity is the key. Now, I'll just run through what are our formal three aims for today. Firstly, we want to give a clear sense of the distinctive value that a neurodivergent person can bring to organizational leadership. Secondly, we want to develop our collective understanding of what is needed to create a workplace where neurodivergent talent and leadership is nurtured and promoted. And thirdly, we want to highlight and acknowledge the myths and the realities of what it's like being a neurodivergent colleague and boss. In terms of the structure, Helen and I are going to work through a series of questions anchored around a few slides for the next 40 to 50 minutes. So it's going to be a talk at, but it's going to be the two of us in conversation. We'll then move on to a Q&A session, which will run through the chat. So please put questions there and obviously put comments in as we're going along, but backload the questions because otherwise I'll forget them and I probably will forget to field them. This means that we can keep recording, that's one of the reasons, and don't have to grapple with issues of confidentiality. Clearly, Helen and I have agreed to be recorded and shared more widely as a result of this. It also means that I would do promise that when I'm fielding the questions in the chat, I will ensure confidentiality of people and any identifying company features. Right, now on to the main events. Now, Helen and I have prepared this, and now the first question for Helen is, now Helen, you're, and I'm using the language that we've discussed, and this is the appropriate way to sort of label and describe you, is you're autistic, and you describe yourself as both an autistic and a neurodivergent person. Could you tell us a bit more about these? And I think you're going to work with some slides.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a pleasure to have so many people on this pop-up. It's been nice to see that's an issue that resonated. So thank you very much. And I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. There we go. So just to check, John, can you see my screen nice and clearly?
Yes, I can.
Marvelous. So I'll just begin with the term autism, as I'm describing myself as an autistic leader, and then I'm going to just set some context to why I use the term neurodivergent. So I'm just going to begin with the medical model for autism, and this is how I was introduced to autism when I was diagnosed. That was me, sat there with a clinician. It took a year to get a diagnosis when I was aged 40. And the medical model describes autism as a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and non-verbal communication and social interaction. And it focuses on the deficits. So, you know, I do find some things really hard. I mean, it's fair to describe these as impairments, but it's a very deficit-focused model. So my diagnostic letter said I had issues with social interaction, communication, a need for structure and routine. And John, you have experienced that firsthand, what that is like to be on the receiving end of that. And also my sensory sensitivities. And this diagnosis was very much rooted in how these disable me in society. So this is one lens that's used to look at autism and having a diagnosis. But there's another model, and this is the one I much prefer, and that's the social model. And that focuses on that person and says, well, is it, you know, the problem with the disabled person, or is it the problem with the disabling society and the extent to which they are included or not, and how that creates barriers? And I think it's important to say the social model acknowledges that I do find things hard. I do have impairments, but it wouldn't be so hard for me if society was more inclusive. And as an example I'll give here, so when I was 10 years old, I had autistic burnout. And that meant I couldn't attend school for nearly 18 months. And if you were to look at autism through the medical model, I was the problem. I was the autistic kid at school who didn't fit in, was struggling, and so I wasn't able to participate. But the social model would look at it through the lens of the school, and to what extent was the school identifying and adapting and meeting my needs? And I think that's a nice example to illustrate the two different models. And here's a diagram which I've taken from Inclusion London. This isn't specific to neurodivergent people or autism, but I think it gives a nice representation of what we mean here by the medical model versus the social model. So there on the left, you know, the problem is seen as the disabled person who is confined to a wheelchair or can't walk, can't see or hear. But if we look at it through the social model, the problem there is the disabling world. And, you know, that's why we're talking about neurodivergent leadership here today, to look at those opportunities to tackle that and to look at greater inclusion. So moving on to the terms neurodiversity, neurodivergent, neurotypical, I'm conscious that a lot of people are not always sure which words to use. And I think it's really important, I find as an autistic person, to be open to that. And it's okay for people to get terminology wrong. So I'm really happy to share with you what I feel comfortable with. But I think it's important to say it's so everybody who is neurodivergent will have their own language that they feel comfortable with. So what works for me might not work for somebody else. So neurodiversity acknowledges everyone is different. It's that umbrella term. But neurodivergent is how I describe myself because my brain functions and processes differently from what is considered typical. So I have an autism diagnosis, but I could include ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. There's a lot of different conditions that would sit under that. And then neurotypical is anyone who is not neurodivergent. And, you know, for me, this is really important to frame myself as a neurodivergent leader because I'm different, not less. And that's why I like to use that language.
So building on that sort of different, not less, which I think is a really, I mean, it applies across so many dimensions. I'd really like to anchor this. So you're given a very, you know, useful general description. And one of the things that we've discussed is you're going to very much anchor this in and own your personal experience. So I'd really like to know now more about what those differences mean in practice for you. And can you tell us about the differences you've found to be strengths as a senior leader?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, thanks, John, for making that point. Autism is a spectrum condition. There's many different neurodivergent experiences. So I'm going to talk about my lived experience, but that's not everybody's. And I think the other thing that is incredibly important to say, most autistic people are not in work. So I am the exception, because only 1 in 5 autistic people are in work, which is a shocking statistic. So again, I think I need to acknowledge that and own that my experience is the exception rather than the norm. The reason I'm sharing it is because I'd like to see that change. So yeah, I'll bring up a slide now to share some of the things that I believe are strengths that I bring to the workplace as a neurodivergent senior leader. So I'll start in the bottom left-hand corner, and I think this is the kind of very stereotypical strength of an autistic person, that hyper-focus, that special interest. So for me, one of my special interests is neurological conditions, which works for me being a CEO of a neurological charity. And I think often people have the stereotypical view of your IT director. They might be a neurodivergent leader. That's certainly a strength I bring, but there's many others as well. And I think it's ever so important to recognise that neurodivergent people can bring more than just that. So moving along to the right, the megaphone there, and this represents the strength I believe I bring of speaking out. So there's been some really interesting research that only came out actually last year from York University in Toronto around autistic people not having the bystander effect. And for me, that came to the fore in 2015 and then 2018 when I blew the whistle on systemic sexual exploitation and abuse at Oxfam. A lot of people knew about it, but why was I the one of the first ones to blow the whistle? And I believe that was because I'm not influenced by that bystander effect and therefore was more likely to speak out. And I think there's a really interesting question there about the extent to which neurodivergent people can be a safeguard in an organisation. And then linked to that, you've got the woman courtesying to the Queen there. And the reason I've used this image is I don't experience social hierarchy. And it's something I've heard from many other neurodivergent people. I just don't see it. And I had the privilege to meet the Queen a couple of years ago, and everybody was very nervous and like, wow, and I was like, I just saw, very, very sweet woman. I recognise intellectually the breadth of experience she brings, but I didn't feel that hierarchy. And again, I think that can be a real strength of neurodivergent leaders, because I will often say the things other people aren't because they're held back by that social hierarchy. So moving on to the right there, for me, this image is representing the way my brain works. So my brain thinks like a logic framework, like a flow diagram. I find sometimes the world very confusing. People's emotional reactions, I'm like puzzled by. I constantly have to think very logically to understand and make sense of that world. And something I found was initially in the commercial sector and then moved into the not-for-profit, is I bring a very balanced argument. I look at the facts, and I believe that brings a strength, because I won't be as easily swayed by some of the emotion that might be in the room. And just going over to the left there with the police officer, I've put this image here as a representation of someone calm under pressure. So a lot of autistic people and neurodivergent people mask. And this is something I didn't realise I was doing until my teens, but you are constantly putting up an image of what you think other people want from you in order to make it in this neurotypical world. I was unable to make or sustain a friendship until I was at secondary school, and I learned to mask and I learned to mirror neurotypical behaviours. That can be really exhausting, and there's a lot of talk in the autistic community and the neurodivergent community about how we can mask less because it's hard to sustain. But also I've learned as a senior leader, it can be a strength because people can't always read me. And that means in high stress situations, I can appear very calm under pressure. I might not always feel it, but that can actually help see a team through a difficult time. And then the last point at the end, neurodivergent people can be incredibly creative. I think it's a stereotype that they're not, and think differently. And I think organisations absolutely need that in senior leaders, the person who's going to be the one that brings an idea that no one else has thought of because their brain is different and they're thinking differently. So, I mean, these are just the strengths I've experienced. Other neurodivergent people will bring other strengths. I don't represent everybody, but I think just gives a flavour for what a neurodivergent senior leader can bring to an organisation.
I just want to, in terms of linking now and again, staying with your personal difference. I'm very struck by your statistic. You say that only 1 in 5 autistic people are in work, and you have been, you have been a success in a very traditional field. You found a way of engaging with the neurotypical world and meeting the rules of the game as they currently are, and you found a way of bringing your difference in a way that can be engaged with. What do you think has helped you?
Interesting. I'd say if you spoke to my colleagues, they'd say sometimes I did this more successfully than other times. And it's been a bit of a wiggly journey sometimes. But I think for me, my mother's played a really important role in my life. She has an ADHD diagnosis. She could not sit still in school. So she left 16, no qualifications. And she ended up being a UK HR director for Sony and then an HR director for HMRC through sheer hard grit, determination, and I think her neurodivergent strengths that she brought to her roles. And she, like me, didn't always get it right. But she also, I have so much respect for the extent to which she did, though, ultimately succeed, despite people often really struggling to understand her and, some difficult situations. So I think I've been really privileged to have a mother who went before me. And even though now I'm in my mid-40s, I still call her up and go, Mum, she's still my, on-call 24/7 speed dial coach. And my son is autistic, and he also has an ADHD diagnosis, he's got dual diagnosis, and I want to be that for him. So I think I'm very, very lucky to have that in my life, and to have that understanding within the family, because a lot of neurodivergent people might be the first one diagnosed in their family or the first one self-identifying. Not everyone wants to get a diagnosis or can access one. So I feel very privileged to have had that.
This is slightly off track from the script, and I'll go back to it in a second. But can you just tell me how important and useful has the diagnosis been to you?
So originally I didn't seek it for myself, although maybe I was lying to myself when I did that. I sought it for my son because he'd been diagnosed, and I thought if he has to live in this world with that diagnosis, he had no choice. We started the process when he was 5, he was diagnosed when he was 6. I thought, and it became very, very obvious through the assessment process. I was like, hang on, this is all incredibly familiar. And I thought, I think I'm a reasonably bright woman. How did I not spot that I was autistic? And then afterwards, I asked people, and they're like, yeah, we thought you were autistic. I was like, why did no one tell me? Because being autistic, sometimes I need people to tell me. So I went through that process because I thought I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. And if he has that diagnosis, then I will, I thought I'm probably going to get one, and I did. And I want him to know that I am going to be open about that, because he's had no choice and I have. And in terms of how helpful, initially it was mixed. When I got the diagnosis, I thought, I thought maybe I could get through it and they would question it, but there was no questioning. They're like, yeah, definitely autistic. So that sort of surprised me at the extent to which it was so obvious to other people. But then since then, and a bit of processing what that's meant, it's given me a huge amount of insight into my childhood and my teens where I really struggled. And now I know why. And it's also given me a huge amount of help because there was a cycle of working for 2 years for an organisation, flat out, burnout, on to the next. And now I understand why that cycle was going on and the changes I've needed to make in the workplace for me to sustain work so I'm not ending up in autistic burnout, and also to improve my communication with other people. So it's just been, for me, fantastic. But everyone's experience is different, and it's a very personal decision whether you decide to go down the diagnosis route or not.
So, and move us back onto the script now. So felt, very comfortable enough now to tell us about, some of the differences, and and the positive side. Could you say a bit more about the challenges, especially having been a senior leader? It's not all sunshine and roses for you.
Yeah, and it's hard to talk about the challenges. It leaves you a bit vulnerable. You don't want people to necessarily know what's going on. And for years, I kept a lot of this private. And I think partly when I was in the commercial world, I thought people would kind of use it against me if they knew what was really going on. And before my diagnosis, probably perhaps felt a little bit of shame and embarrassment about this. But since I've got my diagnosis, I think it's important I do share, because I want to help people understand how I tick, so that we can all have a better workplace experience. So yes, I'll start with the top, the lady there with the hat and the gloves. So sensory needs really impact my day-to-day world. So again, a stereotype of autistic people is noise, and that you're going to need noise cancelling headphones. For me, that's not as much of an issue, and I think you can manage quite discreetly with earbuds. Actually, hot and cold. So like a number of autistic people, I really struggle to name and label and understand my emotions. And actually, a lot of this I experience physically. So if I'm feeling a bit anxious, I might experience that as a cold shiver, rather than being able to recognize I'm a bit stressed or worried. And therefore, I'll need to put the heating on, I'll need to layer up, I'll need to take those layers off. I need to constantly be sort of like tapping, so a bit of a stim. And I do my discreet ones, I like a tap behind my ear, or I need to suck peppermint. So they're ways that I manage that, but it's constant. I'm constantly needing to stim, and I've got these sensory needs, particularly hot and cold for me. So going down that blurry image, not all autistic people, but some, and actually some have this without an autism diagnosis, have something called aphantasia, where you don't visualize. It never occurred to me till a couple of years ago that other people can see images in their head. When people said I'm visualizing, I thought they're thinking of an object, like a tree has branches. My mind is a black space of nothingness, is empty. And that's the thing, probably the one thing, if I could change, I wish I could, because it means I really struggle to recognize faces. And in the past, people just thought, gosh, she's a bit rude. I'd be in a room. There was a woman who we were at a group together, and there's this woman, she'd always wave at in the school playground when I dropped my son off, and I thought, who's she? And then one day she said, Helen, why do you always ignore me? And I hadn't put that face from the group to that face in the playgrounds. And it can also impact autobiographical memory, so I find that hard. And this also links into my memory generally. My short-term memory is pretty much non-existent, and the only way that I can recall short-term memory is by writing it down. So there's something for me about the transfer from it's happened, I've written it, then it can move into my long-term memory. And that can work in meetings. So my workaround is I write everything down. And people think I'm taking notes to read back over them. I'm not. I never read them, but it processes my memory from short to long term. But then if I have social conversations, I can't write it down. And then I forget. And then people, when you're in a leadership role, they think you don't care about the social things, that someone's told you something's happened in their personal life. So workaround I do now is I send myself a text message. They think I'm just messaging somebody, and I'm not. I'm sending a text message to write down what they've told me so that I can recall it. And then moving on to the woman with her hands over her mouth. I mean, this again is more stereotypical. I put my foot in it all the time. I can't do small talk. I practice. I try and learn. I'm terrible at it. My ex-husband used to joke that I could kill a dinner table conversation in one sentence, and he was absolutely right. I have that as a special superpower. And in meetings, sometimes I do say things which everyone stops talking. I'm like, oh, right. And it's because I do find it harder to read people. And it's something I work really, really hard at. So it doesn't happen as much nowadays, but it does sometimes. And then the top two, the woman there looking pretty stressed out. This represents autistic burnout. And so if you think, for me, day to day in a meeting, I will be thinking about my sensory needs, how I can meet those. I'll be worried about forgetting what people look like if I bump into them in the corridor. I'm working really hard to tackle my short-term memory. I'm being super mindful of saying the right thing and being really vigilant to all the social cues. And over time, when you're constantly adapting to meet the needs of neurotypical people, it takes a toll on you. And that's when autistic burnout
Helen,
happens. And that isn't depression. It's a very Oh, sorry, I thought someone said something there.
Yeah, no, I did say something. You were just breaking up for a second.
Oh, thank you, John. For, hopefully my internet will hold. So yeah, so that is a very physical experience. And then this is a really embarrassing thing to talk about, that angry person there, meltdowns. Autistic people do sometimes have meltdowns, and that's not getting angry, it's a loss of control. It lasts about 45 minutes. It's a very physical response. I haven't had a meltdown for a very long time in the workplace, but it's very shameful when you lose your cool in that way and you lose your temper, and your colleagues see a different side to you. And it can be really confusing, because if you've been masking in the workplace and your colleagues haven't seen a side of that to you, they struggle to understand it. So, I mean, the reason I share all of these things are because there are things which society can adapt and ensure they include you better to support you with this if they have a better understanding. So that's why I'm sharing all these things. They're things that can be worked through together. And just to reiterate, these are my experiences, and other people's will differ.
So, Helen, you used the phrase hypervigilance, and I think in our conversations that we've had over the last few weeks, I can, particularly because you're so skillful with your masking, I can forget, or I did forget so often, how hard you were working. And so I'd be going into the conversation feeling relaxed, and this was going easy, and I had discounted completely how much extra workload you had in order to be in a conversation. So that maybe is the segue now into sort of the next question, which is actually to talk about some of the myths and the realities that you've come up against, because you are, speaking, you're one of the very few openly autistic charity chief executives. So you can say something quite original on that. So do talk about that personal experience.
Yeah, those myths and the realities, and yeah, John, just coming back to that point about that masking, yeah, because I think at times it was, I remember a board member who I disclosed I was autistic to, and she said, "Oh, but you're one of the good autistics, aren't you?" I was like, okay, and I am mindful that I am skillful at masking, but something I'm working to do is to find that sweet spot for me. Sometimes I feel comfortable with the mask. I want to use it because it feels safe to be behind it. And that's probably something to do with the late diagnosis. But also I know I need to let it down sometimes, because otherwise people aren't experiencing me. And then it can be a surprise when they do. And I can see someone in the comments saying the good autistic. Yep. I was just internally seething when this person said that to me. But that is what some people think. And John, that led for you, it wasn't easy at some points, because you were then a bit surprised. So, I mean, coming on to some of those myths and realities, I think one of the common myths is that kind of Rain Man film image. And I kid you not, but people still, for many people, that is their understanding of what autism is. And there are some extraordinary people who have exceptional recall, mathematical abilities, like the vast majority of autistic people don't though. And I certainly don't, and that can be a challenge when there's that almost that expectation that you've got to be an openly autistic person. You've got to have that kind of superpower and that amazing strength, and a lot of us don't. So I think it's really important to break down that myth, but also to emphasize that there is a breadth of skills there, and that focus on these technical skills We need to open up people's understanding of autism and to recognise those breadth of skills. I think another myth I've come across is people would assume I wouldn't work in the charity sector. A lot of people think neurodivergent people don't experience the depth of emotions that neurotypical people do. And that's just not true. I feel things incredibly deeply, but I'm hopeless at expressing them. It doesn't mean I don't experience them, doesn't mean I don't feel them. And I feel a huge amount of empathy for the charity work I do and compassion. My challenge is that ability to communicate those feelings and emotions, but I'm very motivated to work in this sector. Another myth is that we make terrible managers. Actually, I've had to work very hard to learn to be a good manager. And like many autistic people, when you have to learn something, you become pretty good at it. I attend all the courses. I'm incredibly mindful. I'm incredibly structured around my management style. And the feedback I've had from many of the people I've managed is that they've really valued and appreciated that. And I think the last thing is people, can think that autistic and neurodivergent people are hard to work with. Oh, got to accommodate to meet their needs, and they're a bit rigid and a bit inflexible. And I just say to people, see it from the other perspective. 24/7, I'm accommodating to meet the needs of neurotypical people in my world. And all I'm asking is just for a little bit of that in return. So it's just, looking for a little bit of that balance. So for me, those are some of probably the myths and my sense of the reality that comes to mind.
I'd just like to pick up on one thing that I've really struck by because it resonates with some of our early conversations. And somebody has talked here about where they're currently working. And so many of the team are neurodivergent because we have such a strong sense of social justice. And I think this is a theme that I've heard you say to me. I remember you saying to me a number of times, is that social justice is something that resonates very strongly with you.
Oh, absolutely. It's just when I see people's views of justice vary, but when I perceive an injustice, I cannot keep my mouth shut. I know, I just can't. And I remember the first time I mooted the idea a few years ago about a potential connection between autism and whistleblowing, underpinned by that sense of a passion for social justice. And I was told, please don't say this publicly because autistic people are already discriminated against enough and you're going to add to that. But then my passion for social justice and my inability to keep quiet meant I couldn't not say what I was thinking. But they're right, though, to be worried about that discrimination. But the more I talk about it, the more other neurodivergent people are saying to me, yeah, I feel the same way. I'd love to see more research around this. I mean, we've seen this piece coming out of Canada from Lorna Hartman around the bystander effect, but I'd love to see more research being undertaken because I think it's a real strength of the autistic community and neurodivergent people, that passion for social justice.
And I'm just thinking, because my own work, along with Megan Rates, is a lot into activism in the workplace. And I've now that, I know you've been talking about this for weeks to me, but the penny has only just dropped in the last minute that, this would be why often you're going to get neurodivergent people who are going to be more associated with whistleblowing and these sorts of things. And so you've got that, compounding of taking, politically difficult positions in organizations, and at the same time having to engage with engaging a world which knows the world differently.
Absolutely. And I think someone once said to me, are you saying that all whistleblowers are autistic people are neurodivergent? Not at all. But I think if we look at the whistleblowing community, my theory, which hasn't yet been tested, is that we may see a greater proportion of those people are neurodivergent than in the wider population, is my hunch.
So I've just noticed in the chat is that people are talking about trying to find out networks and these sorts of things. So I'll just make two comments about that before doing my next question for Helen. First of all, Helen can be available through her LinkedIn. And what's the name of your actual charity, Helen?
I work for Cavanoma Alliance UK, which is a rare neurological condition charity.
And right, so that will go out in the newsletter that Chris is going to send out at the end of this. And also Angus Watson for the GameShift world is going to be the anchor. So again, if you want to sort of engage with GameShift explicitly around this, and Helen is going to be part of the world on this. So that's the network. So we'll be looking to act as a hub on this, or join other hubs. So that's the sort of where to go next piece. Helen, next question. And this is more addressed, and this, you know, you've had to explain things to me again. You've been having to explain to neurotypical people throughout your entire life. What are the tips you'd give someone like me about as neurotypical as you can get, so that we can nurture and promote neurodivergent talent and leaders in the workplace?
Yeah. So I think that, and we talked about this, and it's been a pleasure working with you, John, because it has been a journey, hasn't it? We've both learned things along the way. I think the first thing is that reframing. So often people come at this like, what can I do to adapt for this autistic person? And I'd go back and say, let's reframe that about, I've been adapting all my life for your needs as a neurotypical person. So let's just reframe that a little bit. I think one of the most important things any organisation can do is, and it sounds incredibly simple, ask the neurodivergent person, people. It's extraordinary how many organisations I see bring in consultants who are not neurodivergent, who are experts, but not autistic or, you know, or ADHD. And I think, how can you bring in people with no lived experience, but apparently experts on this, to then tell an organisation what is needed for neurodivergent people? So ask the neurodivergent people within your own workforce, and bring in, if you're going to bring in external consultants, bring in those with lived experience. Please don't commission consultants who have got no lived experience within their team. And I think the second thing is, we're not a homogenous group. And often there's a sense of, right, we've got this work plan, this is going to meet the needs of all the new neurodivergent people in our workforce. Not at all. There's a huge amount of, there's a whole spectrum of variance within the group. So it's incredibly important to recognise that, and to think about the intersectionality as well of the neurodivergent group. And I think the next thing is it's not easy. Communication between neurotypical and neurodivergent people can break down. I mean, John, we had a moment where we both were like, oh, are we actually going to do this pop-up together? But we had the space to work it through, and we did work it through. And I think organisations often shy away the minute it goes wrong, they back off. But if this was easy, you know, we wouldn't be having these conversations right now. So actually allowing it to go wrong sometimes, that's okay. You can then still work that through together and learn. And, you know, like you and I did, we thought that was a really tough conversation, but we reflected on it. And I think our working relationship's stronger for it. And I think two just last points would be, if you're neurotypical, don't take it personally. Please don't take it personally, because it's never intended to be personal. And I just give people that little bit of flex. And the last thing is, don't be tokenistic. I mean, I delivered a training, and after I delivered it, they said, great, we're put on our website that we've been trained and that we're neurodivergent friendly. And I was like, whoa, 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 you've had one training course, and I don't know whether you're going to apply what I've told you. It's incredibly important not to just be tokenistic with it, and actually to really, you know, live those values and walk it through before you make any claims like that.
So thank you. So I'm going to formally ask, I've taken a few questions down. We're now going to sort of move into the sort of the Q&A piece, looking at the timing.
And John, may I just have a couple of minutes to give tips for neurodivergent people? Do you think I've got...
Sorry, I skipped over the question 6.
My structured questions that I've given you. Yeah, I'm going to reference back to that.
Oh, Helen, would you like to give some tips to new?
Yes, John, I would quite like to. I'll quickly do that. So yeah, just, I know we've got some neurodivergent people on this pop-up as well. So just a few tips for them. Like, a lot of people, I chat to people quite a bit on LinkedIn, and they'll say to me, look, I haven't told my boss I'm neurodivergent. What do you advise? And I think I'd say it's really important is it could be so easy for me to say, yeah, tell everybody, be openly neurodivergent. But the reality is, and we shared this earlier, 1 in 5 autistic people aren't in work, and there's still a lot of discrimination. So when people ask me this question, I have to say the truth is to really think about the workplace you're in right now. And is it safe to do that? Have you got that psychological safety within the workplace? And sometimes it might be start a conversation with other neurodivergent people. It might be go and get a neurodivergent coach. There's some amazing coaches who are themselves neurodivergent. I find I communicate with neurodivergent people in a way I don't with neurotypical, and it just flows so much easier. So that can be a great help. And I think, though, if you're in a workplace where you're thinking, I don't feel safe to say I'm neurodivergent, please don't feel that the burden's on you to change that, because often it's like, people come to you and go, right, well, you tell us what the solutions are, you fix the problem. Please don't feel that's always on you. It's something you may want to do, but don't feel obliged. And sometimes it might be that actually your organisation isn't ready or willing to change, and it may be looking at another role if that's an option for you. So yeah, those would be my tips for neurodivergent people. And thank you, John, for letting me just cover that off before we move into Q&A.
Yeah, no, and I realise so now it's sort of, again, if people pop some questions, I've got a couple that I've noted, and while people do put some questions up there, I just, one of the things that really stood out for me when you were talking about how we worked through it was, where we had the bumps in the road in our relationship, it was the space to work it through. And this again fits with a particular research thing that I'm fascinated with, is it is the way that we squeeze out. You will have differences, and there will be points where you don't connect, where you get it wrong with each other. And it's particularly for me, it was allowing me to sort of lose the heat of my emotion and to step back into that space of curiosity, rather than I went through shamefully all the classic reactions of saying, well, Helen's difficult to deal with, rather than thinking, you know what, I am reacting rather than responding. And it was, again, the fact that we had some time, and it was something that you'd insisted we did, which is, can we actually build in a couple of conversations before today, which are spread out over a period of weeks, which meant, again, we began to learn to engage with each other, and we had the breathing space. And you'd obviously, I'm assuming, obviously thought, if there is a bump, we are going to need time to work this through.
It was fascinating, John, because I explained to you about autism, and then I explained that sometimes I say things a little bluntly, which is what I did. I said something a bit bluntly, and then when you responded, my logical brain was like, I've told John I'm autistic, I've talked it through, we're going to do a pop-up on this, and here he is getting a bit, ruffled about this. And that was really interesting. And then I reflected, I thought, I've masked a hell of a lot with you through our conversations. So it doesn't matter what I've said in terms of our experience of our conversations. This is the first time you've seen that. So no, it was really good to have that space. And for me, for me to work in a way that's healthy for me, I'm part-time. I do my CEO role 3 days a week. I'm home-based. And that meant in our time, I had that flexibility to have those chats with you. But not everybody can put that in place for their workplace. It's not easy for everybody, but I'm really glad we had that time, because it's nice to have come through that. And, I hope we'll continue working together in the future.
And I just wanted to pick up the thing that I take the piss out of myself when describing the situation to friends and colleagues. I say, Helen explained exactly, this is what you're going to encounter. This is how I make sense of the world. And I then promptly, and again, I think it was because of the skill that the masking, I then ignored everything you told me. And it was a classic example of, take seriously what someone is telling to you, really listen to it and remember it and don't forget it.
And it's hard, because when I mask, I smile. I smile through saying really tough things. I just can't help it. It is something I've done for all my life. So it's not easy. But yeah.
So I'm just going to make a note of some of the questions that were coming out earlier, which one of the earlier ones was, how many people do you think are unaware that they have some kind of neurodiversity in the workplace?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the figures on this, because for years the National Autistic Society would say prevalence is about 1 in 100. When you speak to clinicians, a lot of them say more like 1 in 30. And you know, the issue at hand there is misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis over years. So in terms of the workplace, if we go with that 1 in 30 figure, you're, you know, much more likely than not to have someone else who is neurodivergent in the workplace with you. What I'm seeing is there's been improvements in diagnosis, although the ability to access a diagnosis for anyone who's got a child trying to get a diagnosis at the moment is appalling. The wait list is 3, 4, 5 years. But there's a lot of adults who are becoming self-aware because of their children. So just like me, their child's diagnosed, and then you have that light bulb moment. So I'd say there's quite a large number of people like myself who will be unaware for years until something shifts, and then they gain that awareness. And that's difficult for them, because they may be experiencing, and you may experience with them, challenges in the workplace that aren't fully understood because there's not yet been that lens of neurodivergence to see it through.
One of the themes that I'm picking up on, I think, is absolutely fascinating, and again, it's this the work from home, and again that the COVID pandemic created this great opportunity, which was the home working. Suddenly, people have much more control over their working space, and now the conversation seems to have crashed into we need to pull people back into the office. And have you begun to find? How do you begin to introduce in your conversations with people that actually working from home is a very inclusive or potentially inclusive thing to do, rather than let me leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, my charity I worked for actually a couple of years ago, and when I worked for them, it was interesting. I first worked for them before I got my diagnosis, and then I've returned since getting my diagnosis. And we actually moved to remote working for cost efficiency reasons. But, you know, clearly there are other benefits as well. I think for me, for anybody who works with me, you can just see my productivity is so much higher when I'm working from home. And I do in-person meetings, but I have to be very mindful to have nothing the day before, nothing the day after. And I've learned I need to travel to those meetings in a car. If I get on a train, it's just too much for me. And that's not to do with noise, it's to do with that sensory load of having to get on, sit next to people you don't know. You've got less control over what is happening. So it's that, for me, it's that balance of absolutely very happy to meet people in person as and when needed. But I think so much can be done on Zoom. We've proved that. And it's inclusive not just for neurodivergent people, but for example, at my charity, people who have a form of capnoma called spinal experience a lot of mobility challenges. Having home-based working means we can include people for whom it can be difficult to get out the home. I think there's so many strengths and benefits to home working, and an awareness that we can do it is, for me, has been one of the positives that came out of the pandemic.
I've just got to read this out from a particular person. They've got 2 questions. I don't know if you can read it, but I'll certainly go on the recording now. This person says, I'm neurodivergent and have 3 neurodivergent children. I have been embarking on a mission to evolve the culture of our firm, and part of that has been me talking about my journey as a now senior leader. However, I had thought other senior leaders would join me, but they didn't, or at least it's very slow or behind closed doors. Any tips on how to evolve that conversation?
It's so tricky because you want people to join you, don't you? It's the most natural thing in the world. And the reality is, though, a lot of people can't. It could be fear of losing their job, and that could be a very real fear, and not being in a position where you can weather that. You know, I'm a single parent. I'm on a low income. I can't afford to lose my job. And but I'm very privileged to be in an organisation that is working for me as a neurodivergent person. And that shouldn't be the case, shouldn't it? It shouldn't be a privilege, but it is. And I think that's difficult right now. Organisations are not as inclusive as they need to be. And for many people, they can't disclose because it's too risky for them right now. And so I think it's for those who can, though, or, who choose to, despite those challenges, I think we've got to keep talking and amplifying our voices as much as possible, because others will come. But it is going to take time. But that is a bit hard.
I think there's a secondary question, which I think resonates with me more generally to, I think, all human beings, which is, so organizations are focused on continuous high performance across all appraisal dimensions. It is an invitation to burnout. And it feels to me that performance management systems reinforce this need to be perfect all the time. Is this your experience? And how do we encourage a change in the idea of a more spiky profile?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the measures you have within that performance management system and what are they valuing. And do they value the diverse range of strengths that neurodivergent people can bring? And most of those performance management systems were designed by neurotypical people. And I think there's a real opportunity there for neurodivergent people to work together to design a performance management system that works for neurodivergent people. I mean, there's so many consultancy opportunities out there for neurodivergent people to produce services and systems, which, if you're in a neurodivergent person in an organisation where you could commission these, and even if you're neurotypical, let's commission more of them from neurodivergent people.
And just again got another question here, and again, this is there anything you would do differently as a senior leader now that you've increased self-awareness due to your diagnosis? I mean, almost, what would you tell your younger self?
I'd love, if I'm being really honest, because you can think about a nice intellectual answer back, but if I'm being really honest, there's some people are really upset. I hate upsetting people. And there's some people in particular I love to go back and say, this was the reason why. I wasn't just being like a really tricky and cranky person. And I hate causing upset, and it's always unintentional. It's never intentional. And I'd love to go back and explain that to people. I don't feel the need to justify it, but I just want to explain. We all want that understanding for people not to think bad of us. I think the other thing, which I do with my son, though, is I want him to be proud. I do not want him to be ashamed of being neurodivergent. And yet the world tells us to be ashamed. I tell people I've got an autistic son, and their first response is like, oh dear. And I want to shift that. And every day I instill in him, a sense of pride in who he is and the difference and the strengths he can bring. And that's what I'd tell my younger self as well, is don't be ashamed of being that kid who no one wants to play with, no one wants to talk to, who when you start in the workplace stands out and you don't get invited to the drinks after work. Be proud of who you are.
I think maybe this is covering some of the themes that you've touched on already, but I don't think that's a bad thing. There is some persistent questions coming up, and this one is, I'm in the process of setting up an employee lead network for neurodivergent people, and we are looking at this issue right now and how to make it a safe environment for people to talk about it. What's again, so just staying deeply with that theme, what's your experience about what makes it a safer environment to talk about it?
So for me, within the workplace, I feel that psychological safety when I'm talking to other neurodivergent people. So if you've got a group led by an HR manager, just because they're the HR manager, and they're neurotypical, are you going to have that psychological safety? Is that initiative being led by someone who understands? But when I'm in a group of other neurodivergent people, and I experienced this initially through reaching out to other parents of autistic kids, many of whom are neurodivergent. I mean, autism is highly genetic. So in most cases, one or both parents, not all, but they will be autistic as well. And that was my first experience of interacting with groups of people neurodivergent. So I think creating those neurodivergent spaces for neurodivergent people, led by neurodivergent people, for neurodivergent people, that when I'm in those spaces, I feel very safe and I feel I can be myself. And I can feel it's the only time I can let that mask down and just feel relaxed, which is lovely.
I'm just looking at this nice one. It links to a direct message I've had as well. And this person says, we moved our son to a new school, supporting his ADHD. On his first day, he sat down at lunch and asked his peers, "So I'm ADHD. Do you have any neurodiversity?" And I'm thinking that sort of invitation for people to own their difference, not just the people who diagnose, but it is that invitation for people of all neurological types to just say, we all have our quirks. Actually, how can we make this a more democratic school of difference?
And I think just to acknowledge, the parents of that child, you're clearly doing something really right, that your son felt comfortable and confident to share that with his peers. So that is just fabulous. And I'd love to see that. But at the same time, I think anyone who is neurodivergent on this pop-up who hasn't yet told their colleagues, don't take away from this that message that you've got to disclose. It's a personal decision. You've got to work out what's right for you in the environment you're in. So please don't feel any pressure. But for those who feel you can share and you've come away from this and thinking, I feel I want to, it feels safe to do so, then it'd be lovely if you could. And particularly those people in senior leadership positions, because if you do it, others in the rest of the organisation will follow. So you've got an amazing opportunity there.
By the way, Helen, I don't know if you're reading them, but there is a huge appreciation for what you're saying and how you're saying it. But and this is going to lead me to ask that particular question. People are talking about the sense of courage that you bring to this, the honesty that you bring to it. What gives you? And again, we've talked about the 1 in 5. I mean, you are your own unique person. But what has given you the courage to be so honest about your experience and go public in an environment like this?
Yeah, I think 2 things. So one, when people say the word courage, I don't engage with that as a concept, if that makes sense, because I can't not. It's just been the case since I was a little child. My mom would say I'd be that person who'd be in a lift to people in a shopping centre, and I'd turn around and go, "I'm Helen. Who are you?" I would just always be that person who I can't help but say what I think. For good or bad, that is the case. I think the second thing is the neurodivergent women in my family. I mean, I talked about my mother who has an ADHD diagnosis. My grandmother also identifies as autistic, and they have always encouraged me. And when I've come home and gone like, no one wants to play with me, everyone hates me, I've put my foot in it at work, they've been there to love me through it. And I've been really lucky though, because a lot of neurodivergent families, you don't always get that. And a lot of neurodivergent families, they've suffered pain. It's been hard. There's not always that understanding. So I've been really, really, really lucky to have that in my life and to be able to bring that into this conversation today.
And what's anchored back into one of the specific experiences you talked about, which is the way that you just worked full bore, doing all this hypervigilance, and after 2 years you just burnt out. How could that organization have helped you at that point, or have noticed, or in the build up to it?
Yeah, I think I have to accept some personal responsibility for this, because I've hid for years a lot of what's really going on inside. I've kept up that mask because I've been ambitious. I've wanted to achieve senior roles. The reason I want senior roles is because if you're in a senior role, you can control your environment. It's like a natural urge to want to strive for that senior leadership position, to be in control so I can have an environment that works for me. But then I have masked, and then people have been surprised. And there is a bit on me. There is definitely on me that if I don't tell people, how are they going to know? So that's something I've shifted since my diagnosis, having those conversations. Some organisations respond well, some organisations respond less well. And then, you can make judgments on that. So yeah, I think for me personally, as late diagnosed and just without awareness, that those are my personal experiences.
Okay, I've just noticed that I've been sent a message through various mechanisms that about at 9:18, somebody sent me a message, and it was about applying for a job. What are the particular challenges for that? Because that resonated with a number of people.
Oh God, the recruitment processes suck for neurodivergent people. There's just no way around it. Interviews, the whole environment of an interview, they do not play to the strengths of neurodivergent people, which is such a shame. But there are some, very vocal advocates for changing those processes. So if anyone's on LinkedIn, there's Neurodiversity in Business, which is doing a survey at the moment, published a survey report previously. They're advocating for changes around this. There's Autistica, which is a research organisation who are also looking at improvements in the workplace. So there's lots of people banging that drum saying recruitment processes need to change if they're going to be inclusive for neurodivergent people. And there's a mixture of, we're starting to see some better practice, but at the moment it is like far from ideal, which is difficult. But what I would say though is a good organisation, the organisation you want to work for is going to be the one that when you say, I'm neurodivergent and these are the changes I need in the recruitment process so that you can see my best self, those are the ones you want to work for, not the ones who are not willing to adapt the process.
That actually, I think this links because the recruitment would fall into this. So it's a question for Helen. Have you had any interactions or clashes with HR when pushing for these groups and spaces that are led by neurodivergent people?
The irony is I used to be HR. So when I worked in the private sector till about 2008, I was in HR. And then I was in HR till I moved into head of safeguarding role. So I was that person. And do you know what? I look back and I'm like, Helen, what were you doing? Because sometimes I was rigid. I was like, this is the process. This is the organizational structure. And yes, you'd be mindful of the requirement for reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. But I look back and I think I didn't open my mind to anything beyond sort of effectively tweaks, to really think what's going to happen if we make a genuine big step change. And I look back and I think a lot of HR professionals are very in the zone of this is what we've done for years, this is what we're going to do, these are the adjustments we've considered permissible, and they're not opening their minds to thinking bigger than that and thinking beyond the boxes they're in at the moment. And I think we've got to see that change happen.
So I got we wondered whether to I'm just going to ask the specific. There's a specific question come up, and then there's another question about somebody raised the question about what have been we've alluded to the bumps in the road, and again, and maybe we can talk about some of the ways that that helped us, what tripped us up when we were working together, and what has helped us recover. But there's a very specific question here: is home working considered a reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act?
Absolutely. So if you have a disability and that's recognised under the Equality Act as an autistic person, I am recognised. Whatever your thoughts on the language of disability, that's just I am recognised under the Equality Act. Then a reasonable adjustment could be home working if it's considered reasonable for you and your employer. So some employers may argue the case that it's not a reasonable adjustment because they feel you can't do your work at home, but it could be a reasonable adjustment depending upon the role that you've got.
Okay, and as I was just looking again, people wanting to be in contact, and I'm just thinking, and again, I will just repeat the thing that sort of we will put Helen's contact details in the message that Chris is going to send out after this conversation.
Just as an autistic person, I will put it out there. It may take me a bit of time to respond. I do get a lot of contact on LinkedIn, and I really value that. Sometimes, though, I'm both a CEO, a parent, an autistic child. I've got my own needs as an autistic person, so I just have to balance that. But I will always endeavour to get back at least within 5 to 10 working days, and your messages do matter to me.
I think, and again, this is the, I think whatever one's neuroprofile, that thing about negotiating, I wish that in my own life I was better at negotiating. Say, I will get back to you in the next 3 to 4 days. I need a breathing space. I need time to consider. And And again, I was introduced to the language that when we were talking about this, we said, oh, Helen, should we have a wash up after this? So at 10 o'clock, we can have, 10, 15 minutes saying, okay, what worked well, where we could have done it differently. And you were very quite explicit to say, no, I will need to pause at that point. I will have used a lot of energy at this thing. And I just think anybody to actively negotiate and set one's boundaries and to respect people when they say, these are the boundaries, this is what I need in order to thrive.
And I can only do this after breaking. I mean, after I was head of safeguarding at Oxfam, left and then blew the whistle, did that twice, 2015, but when it was in the public domain, 2018, I hit rock bottom, absolutely hit rock bottom. But from that, I could build myself back up. And I was incredibly fortunate to have 2 years of psychotherapy through a charity who offered it at a very, very, hardly charged me at all because I couldn't afford it at the time, with a therapist who really understood autism. And so many don't, but I was incredibly privileged too. And the interesting thing was, I can't do this for myself, but the framing that she got me to think about was, I do want to be a good mother. And I want to do it for my son. And I want to role model healthy behaviors for him. I do not want him to burn out. And so with that in my mind, I can give myself permission to do this so I can be a good mum for him. Otherwise, if I was doing it for myself, I don't think I would. I find it really hard to assert those boundaries just for myself. So that works for me.
I think this is a very rich observation. I'll just read it out to you, which is, I feel some organizations can inadvertently take advantage of neurodivergent people who are trying to manage an excessive workload, but deprioritizing self-care and burning out. So being more aware of the impact of their demands have on individuals and promote a better balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like working. Working helps me self-regulate. If I'm stressed, so most people, they find that they need to rest to feel less stressed. Working helps me work through stress because it's so logical and it just feels good. But that means I could get up at 6 and work straight through to 10 o'clock at night without taking many breaks and feel good. But clearly you can't sustain that. But when you're working for an employer who goes, wow, they are super productive and they will push that, then there is that absolute, likelihood and risk of burnout. And that is not healthy work practices or responsible work practices.
Yeah, I think it's, I like my sort of skeptical thing is that somebody's comment, it's not that inadvertent sometimes. And that's thing. I've just had some messages from Philippa. You've been, you can, I think you're legitimate to be unmuted and whatever. You've identified some questions that I've been missing. Can you either pop them in the?
I mean, there are so many good good questions, and if we don't capture them all now, we will make sure that in due course we will go through them, make sure we've answered them all. But there was a question from Alicia, which of course typically I've now lost, but it was about sharing information with neurotypicals and your experience of doing that, and how do you do it in a way that is helpful all around. I'm so sorry, Alicia. I had your message and it's currently disappeared from my screen.
By the way, Philippa, we're trying not to name people.
Sorry, but it was at 0909, but I now can't find the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really good question about having those conversations with neurotypical people and how best to have them. I mean, I've had a range of experiences. Some people who are a bit like, why do you need to bang on about autism? You seem fine. Do we need to talk about it? Which is like the depressing end of the conversation. And then people, John, like you, who are curious, who want to know. It's like, Helen, educate me, tell me. And I think in terms of what works best, John, I think we've role modeled that. You can give the theory, but that won't change behaviors or attitudes until you've lived it together. And I think it's about living that together and working through that consciously. So something, when I was working at Oxfam, they had action learning sets, where you have people together in a group who are actively learning. I mean, there's different frameworks for it. But I think, it could be quite interesting to have a small group of people, a mixture of neurotypical, neurodivergent, perhaps meeting once a week or once a month with this question of exploring those communication differences between neurotypical, neurodivergent people and working those through together and actually applying those and then reflecting on how that application has worked. I think to affect genuine behaviour change and to improve genuine understanding, it's got to be applied in practice.
So I'm going to sort of, again, I'm trying to try it. So there's three very meaty ones. So someone's come up with, is the distinction binary between neurodivergence and neurotypical? I wonder if some of the insights and behavior changes apply to personality types and generational characteristics.
So it's to be neurodivergent, it means you identify or have a diagnosis of, for example, autism, ADHD. To get that diagnosis meant that the characteristics I was describing reached a certain threshold. But some people may have some characteristics that mirror my own, but together or the extent to which they impact their day-to-day living don't put them to the point of that diagnosis and that threshold. So I think there can definitely be sort of traits that people may experience and kind of empathize with, but not yet be at that threshold of a diagnosis. So I think it's a really important point to raise, because it's very easy and convenient to put people in boxes, but that's the reality. Is life is not like that, is it? It's much less clear, and there's much more grey areas. So I think that's an important point to raise.
So there's a very specific question and then a more general one, which is, so it says, a question for Helen. I've recently been advised by my neurodiversity workplace strategies coach to apply for an access to work grant for a virtual PA. I've been awarded funding for this. I really wish I had known about this when I moved into a managerial role. What are your thoughts, ideas on raising awareness of DWP access to work grants, especially for support workers, including VPAs, in the workplace amongst the ND community and employees?
Oh, I'm so glad this point was raised, because I haven't raised it, and it's a really, really important one. It's out there, and not enough people apply for access to work. And actually, when you do, there's a substantive amount of free support that can be available to you. And a lot of people will think, but, can I justify it? Will they be open to it? I'd say absolutely look it up. Just Google access to work. It comes up very quickly at the top of the Google options. And I know people who've accessed support through it, and it's been transformative. And it's something I haven't done. And as it's been raised, I'm thinking, why haven't I? And probably like many people, I've thought, oh, do I need it enough? And actually, the reality is I know I could do with that support. So thank you very much for raising that point. And yes, please, if you're on this and you don't know about it, look it up.
And I was really interested I nearly didn't read that out as a question, because I was thinking, in my life, I was thinking, well, this feels like quite a niche concern. And I just noticed the energy that, this really mattered to you. And again, I was thinking about the earlier comment of, no comments, no processes, no strategy without our involvement. And again, it's I came at it from a completely, my worldview. Yet again, I had forgotten about how other people experience life.
I can see in the comments there, just one flashed up about, there are challenges with access to work. It's certainly, it's not perfect, and there are some challenges as well. So, thanks to the person who just flagged some of the difficulties.
And I think
John, sorry, John, I was just going to say there's just another question from sort of 20 minutes or so ago about, Helen, whether you think younger generations are more open and inclusive to neurodiversity as it's becoming a topic that's getting more airtime and understanding, say, in comparison to 10 years or so ago.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a shift that I can feel. So last night I was talking to, I call him a young man. He's in his 20s. It's not that young, but it's to me, who has a diagnosis, and he is seeing things differently to me. There's definitely a shift, as is my son, who is 10 years old. And I can see, more people being diagnosed, although there's profound barriers to accessing a diagnosis on the NHS at the moment for children, and huge waiting lists for CAMS. But I think because of that, and there is a shift in the schools as well. And when I was at school, I don't recall autism ever being discussed. Although looking back, there was obviously another autistic child in my class. And that's, most children, when you ask them, they will have an awareness of what autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia mean. So I think we are seeing that shift. And I am really hopeful things will be better, because I think the expectations of young people, they are expecting more of their employers, quite rightly so. And those of us in our 40s, 50s, 60s on the call here in those leadership positions have an obligation then to respond to that call and those expectations, and to meet those for those young people.
It's a very specific question, and sort of looking at the time we're heading towards wrapping up. And it's around the whole disciplinary field. And it's what advice would you give to organizations and neurodivergent people who slide, I like this framing, who slide towards the disciplinary route?
I think so often in the workplace, we talk about sort of a binary lens of seeing things. It's either you're a good performer or you're not, and either you're underperforming or there's an issue with your behaviours. And what's the mechanism we're going to apply? A disciplinary framework. It's so archaic and traditional, isn't it? And often I have seen autistic people who then fall into that process of the disciplinary process, when actually what is needed is a misunderstanding of communication. And if there was improved communication between all parties, it would never have got to that point where disciplinary action was being taken. And I think that is so important for employers to just pause and think. Often they think, oh, this individual is being a bully. Actually, this individual's trying to communicate. They're communicating in a clear and direct way that feels natural and intuitive for them as a neurodivergent person, and it's being misunderstood and felt as something else. So I think it's really important for organizations to just pause and think, whether there's a diagnosis or not, whether someone's open or not about a diagnosis, is there a communication difference here? That's another way of looking at it. Is there a communication difference here that is underpinning this challenge we're all experiencing? And could that be addressed before we move into this disciplinary framework?
I'm actually sort of going to begin to pull us towards a pause. And I sort of, we've got the specifics, and I don't know whether this is from a processing point of, this is going to be an easy or difficult question. This is our first live encounter in front of a real audience, rather than in the privacy of our personal conversation, where we had the space and time to recover. Sort of when has this conversation been helpful for you, and when's it got in the way? What's worked and well and less well?
Yeah, so I think for me, John, what I really appreciate is, typically when you suggest this pop-up, you probably thought, right, we'll have a chat and then we'll have a pop-up. You've probably spent about 10 hours of prep time with me on this. And I'm really grateful for that, because you took the time with me and were responsive when I said, this is what I need, to sit down, and we worked on the questions together. We had quite a bit of back and forth on that. I've sent you a script of what I wanted to say, and effectively sort of scripted what I want you to say. Yeah. And you've gone with that. Thank you, because that's meant, actually, I felt very, I talked before about psychological safety. I felt that safety coming into this pop-up, and I felt secure knowing that we both had a really good shared understanding of our intention for this. And that has meant, I'm feeling good. I'm intrigued. I haven't been able to follow all the flow of comments. I'm intrigued to hear how others have experienced that. But for me personally, I really appreciate you, meeting me halfway and doing this in a genuinely inclusive manner.
I mean, to me, it is. I noticed that as I was observing the comment about my experience of when we hit our bumps together in the 10 hours of prep.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed it was when I lost my curiosity in your experience, and I turned in on myself. And that it doesn't matter who I'm with, what their profiles are. It's just I notice that when I turn in on myself and I'm not orientated to the other, then the conversation, then I'm not listening well, I'm not connecting well, I'm not paying attention to the needs of others to digest and respond in at their own pace.
I mean, I basically have asked you to apply change in your normal way of working. And I'm very grateful for the fact that you're up for that challenge, because I think it role models, you know, the opportunities here. So thank you for that.
So before I'm going to hand over to Chris and Philippa to sort of do the thanks and what happens next, is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish? Any sort of thoughts that are really staying with you? Something that you've seen in the chat? Something that you're just thinking, yeah.
95 people on this chat. Wow. You know, but that shows people care. And you'll be on this pop-up for a range of reasons. You might be a neurodivergent leader who is curious to connect with others and hear other people's experiences. You might be someone working in HR, wanting to do more for your organisation. Whatever your reasons, this is a really good sign that there's interest there. And I think just my ask is just think, what's the one thing that you want to do differently as an outcome of what you've learned today? Because if every person on this pop-up does one thing, there's an extraordinary opportunity there for that ripple effect. And yet I'm feeling optimistic. This gives me hope that there is such interest in this topic. And I'm ever hopeful. I'm ever hopeful things can improve.
I'm just remembering the Barack Obama thing, you know, keep hope alive. I'm thinking that's always been one of the loveliest political sentiments. Helen, this has been a gorgeous conversation, and I've learned so much about myself and being in relationship with people and with people who are neurodivergent. So thank you. And Chris and Philippa.
Well, actually, it's going to be me, although I will be saying thank you on behalf of both Chris and myself and everyone in GameShift and everyone on this call. I know a number of people have had to go to meetings, and I know also that we had also a large number of people who weren't able to attend this morning, but really wanted to get the recording of this, and they will see all the questions as well. So again, Helen, I can only echo John's thanks, and also thank you to John for your help and all the care and attention that you've taken to make this such an interesting and productive and really rich conversation. There were a huge number of comments and questions in the chat, and given the vagaries of the chat, some of the streams of conversation meant that potentially some questions we missed. So if you did have a question that did not get answered, can we just ask that you email angus@gameshift.co.uk? He put his email in the chat earlier, just with pop-up question in the title, and just reiterate your question, or if any other questions immediately following this. And hopefully, Helen, that's all right to say that we will make it possible to get answers to those some questions. So thank you to everyone for coming. We really appreciate your attention, your presence, and I just want to also say that our next pop-up, because this is we host them regularly, our next pop-up is on the 14th of March at the same time, and it's all around transformation for teams. So we very much hope that if this is your first time at a GameShift pop-up, you are most welcome to come to any of the others. We will send you the details of the next one when we send the recording. But in the meantime, thank you very much again. And once again, huge thanks to Helen and John, and to everybody. Have a good day. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Helen.